Well, today is our third Sunday in Advent, Gaudete Sunday. So named, I understand, from the Latin words of the Mass that is sung, Gaudete, rejoice. It is our time of joy. And for those of you with an eagle eye, you will have noticed that we lit a pink candle this week, slightly off the purple. Well, as many of you will know, each Sunday in Advent, this Advent, we have decided to pay attention to the voice of the prophet Isaiah. Thus far, this voice has been expressed in the words of poetry. Each week unveiled a vision of transformation and hope, thronging multitudes of people, creation itself renewed so it may flourish. The last 2 weeks we've celebrated the coming transformations of weapons, of economies, of social orders and of animals. Today we celebrate the coming transformations of land, of human brokenness, of locations, emotions, and destinies. We take readings from their place in Isaiah and we use them for our intention and purpose in our season of Advent. We hear words from Isaiah echoed in the Gospel of Matthew today, rejoicing words of hope, of restoration and flourishing fulfillment. But a closer consideration of Isaiah requires us to pay attention to the place of today's reading within the corpus and the context of the full text of Isaiah. As is the habit of our lectionary, we separate out pieces to serve our purpose. So it might be helpful today to consider that Isaiah 35, that we heard some verses from today, is of a piece with its previous chapter, Isaiah 34. They are as two sides of a coin, some say. Unlike today's words, redolent with hope and promise, the words and imagery of Isaiah 34 portray a God of vengeance, a God who deals punishment and ultimate destruction on the unfaithful, in particular the unfaithful people of Edom, who collaborated with Babylon and the devastation of Judah that led to them being in exile. In stark contrast to Isaiah 34, today's reading portrays a God of restoration and deliverance who rewards those who are faithful. The holy highway imagery of Isaiah 35 is almost the direct inverse of the road to destruction of the previous chapter. It is considered that these are placed within what's known as First Isaiah, the context prior to exile, but it's confusing because these verses seem to be speaking to the exiles in Babylon, so it's thought they may have been put back a little bit in Isaiah in the process of the total corpus of Isaiah becoming as it is. But the rite of imagery that runs through the verses of Isaiah today has a basic concern for restoration of wholeness. As you heard, the wilderness and the dry land through which the exiles will return also participates in the restoration. It is as if this holy way to Zion is a reversal of the Exodus journey. Rather than a journey of wilderness and suffering, it is one of flourishing and abundance. And in it we do hear the reversal of blindness and deafness and lameness and muteness. But in case we presume from this that being blind or deaf or lame or mute makes someone less than whole, it's helpful. The Oxford Bible Commentary reminds us that this Isaiah context, in this context of our Babylonian exile, the blind and the deaf are talking about the community itself. This section plays an important part in proclaiming the restoration of that community to full humanity. The intent and imagery of the poem is to bring hope to those in exile. That's why we think it's better in Isaiah too, connecting old hopes with the need for new ones. But I was interested, as I explored more deeply, to read this. Isaiah 35 understands that though certain of the old promises had come true, their fulfillments were somehow unfinished. In specific, the promise of the wilderness highway for exiles had already come and gone. The captives from Babylon had returned to Zion long ago, but disappointments met them. Judah was a prolonged devastation. New oppressions overtook it. Now, in the far extended bleakness, this poet chooses to retrieve the vision of a highway in the desert, The promise will be fulfilled once more, but its meaning will be deeper and broader and more finally true. So we too in our time retrieve from Isaiah this beautiful poetry, this vision. We can understand the imagery and vision within its context and time. We did a tiny little bit of that. Sermons are only this long. But we still use this text today. We use it to point to and inform our Advent narrative. Not just the one that talks of the birth of Jesus, Emmanuel, God with us, but one that also talks about Christ who will come again, with vision, imagery, hope of divine restoration. So how does this vision that we hear today, that we still want to be part of our vision of what is to come, how does it make sense now? Well, as you all know, how we hear a text depends on who we are. It depends on where we're located. It depends what we want and or need for the text to speak to us. So we choose how we listen, and we choose what we hear. A year or 3 ago, I had the good fortune to spend some holiday time on Martha's Vineyard. My sister I was staying with, her family she married into has a place there. Well, one evening, my sister and I decided to go to the far end of the island from where we were staying to an annual event. Each year, a number of African American choirs, often along with some quite remarkable soloists, converge on the island to perform a concert, which makes it sound a lot more posh than it actually was. It was more like a jam session for those who were just incredible musicians. There was impromptu combinations of choirs, musicians, instruments, and voices. It took place in a plain, painted timber church. There was a curious circular structure, and it was far too hot for any choir robes. Hymns and spirituals and quite incredible impromptu solos were threaded through with a narrative. Some of that was personal testimony. Some of it was stories behind the reason these spirituals or these hymns that had either been written for this or were from the past were important for the people that were singing it. Some of them were passed through parents and grandparents for generations. There were stories of times gone by, times of slavery and oppression, and yet for many of those who were speaking, it was a continuing narrative for them of oppression and prejudice and injustice. So I listened to these words, these hymns, these scriptures of hope, just like the one we heard today, of exiles seeking freedom from oppression, the hope of dwelling in a land not as outcasts, demeaned and diminished and denied fullness of flourishing. I listened with a dawning awareness. I was hearing words that I knew, yet I was hearing the meaning of them in a way in stark contrast to the usual way I did. Usually I hear such promises of restoration and transformation as words of hope of how things will be different. When moments of restoration and transformation break through in a moment in time, that makes God known to us. And when we are a part of this, we participate in making God real. But as I listened to the voices in song and prayer and testimony, what I came to hear was that hope was not so much in the restoration of things occasionally or sometime later. Hope was now. In all the overwhelming challenges of life, God, Jesus, was always and abidingly with them. The promise is that they are never alone or abandoned, but accompanied, in the company of a God who loves them fiercely and dearly. Hope was a now thing, and there were many tears of joy. This wasn't a triumphalist narrative. It wasn't a narrative that assumed God was on their side and would be known when everything was restored according to their vision or their program of things. It was a narrative that spoke of knowing and experiencing that whatever life would bring, God was with them. It made all the difference. it transformed their world. So I began to wonder if such way of hearing and knowing and receiving and living in a God-present world was the experience of those in exile. As with those who knew exile in Babylon, the poetry of Isaiah reminded and restored to them the hope and promise that God present was with them in all of life, despite the appearance of things. That my ear is attuned so differently made me pause. Have I learned to hear differently because I have power and privilege? Could it be that I hear from the vantage point of one who oppresses? Unknowingly that I am an oppressor in systems that oppress. I would really, really like to soften that, but maybe the hardness of it is necessary for me to dwell with. I know that I want the world for creation to be restored and creation to flourish. But how much of my creation-destroying comfort am I willing to give up? I love the idea of the hungry being fed and the oppressed being set free. I love the idea of there being a fair and just distribution of resources so each has enough for their need. I love the idea because I desire to follow the Jesus way. I desire to trust myself to God's beneficence, to the embrace of God who loves me. But am I willing for the freedom this grants me, because I am in a position of power, because I have more resources than I need? Am I willing to have that encroached upon to ensure the freedom and release of others? And am I willing to risk endangering my version of the way the world is and having it upended by another real of somebody else's? In Advent, we hear these words from Isaiah, and they echo in Matthew. In Advent, when we tell of God born among us, when we say we know the promised Emmanuel has come, why are we singing, "Come, O come, Emmanuel"? Is it because, just as with that community that was post-exile that Isaiah was speaking into, Jesus' visitation among us is an unsatisfied fulfillment? Things just don't seem to be that different. Real captives and refugees suffer in the present. The earth is a burning desert. Bodies are broken, cities are joyless, and human hearts everywhere are sighing. Our world isn't like this by chance. A lot of it happens because of the choices we make. The choices we make to keep going a system of privilege that denies people and puts them in context of exile, not just humans anymore, but our very creation. But when we as people of privilege have the privilege of choosing, and we recognise the way things are, and we recognise it's an outcome of the choices we've made, and we really want to do things differently for different outcomes, what is our resource for choosing otherwise? Well, poetic visions of hope of long ago, like those from Isaiah, are part of a narrative through time, a narrative that has withstood the test of time, that bears a wisdom within a context yet isn't confined there. Texts such as this provide a broader scope, a perspective more tested and considered of how to live and how to be and the outcome than is possible for us to know within the time-bound limit of our lifetimes. Could it be the wisdom they bear is the kind of resource that you and I need? The vision of hope and the vision of what happens when we don't live that way? Could they hold up to us a mirror that makes us accountable and provides us with a challenge so we can choose differently? Our Advent challenge is to reimagine this old story from Isaiah for our time and our place. As I listen to the voices of those in Martha's Vineyard, we might learn to hear that old story differently We might learn to hear it told through the experience of those in exile. And through them, the gift we receive is to be reminded, to be reconnected, to be recommitted to Isaiah's vision, that despite the appearance of things, despite our inconsistency, we are part of a story that says, God is here. God is a now reality. And whether that God is made known depends very much on what we do.